So I'll get started and folks will still be joining in for a minute or two more. Welcome everyone to Preservation Connecticut's Talking About Preservation. And our guest today is Jonathan Kinney with the SHPO office. And he'll be talking about looking forward to 2021 with the SHPO. So welcome, Jonathan. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
So Preservation Connecticut, we are the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization. We have a staff of 8, and this is our boarding house, our headquarters in Hamden, Connecticut on Whitney Avenue. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director. Chris Wiegren is our Deputy Director, and he is our in-house architectural historian, published author of a recent book, Connecticut Architecture, 100 Stories. He is the editor of our Preservation newsletter, and he administers our easement program. Renee Tribert is our Preservation Services and Making Places Manager. She coordinates all of the inquiries from developers and municipalities regarding the historic mill sites in Connecticut and rehab for those. And she coordinates our preservation services, our fee for service work, where we can assist anyone with tax credit applications or National Register nomination, State Register nomination, things like that. Jordan Sorensen is our development director and also works on special projects. She helps with social media, membership, events, and with those fee for service projects, assisting Renee. And Kristen Hopewood is our development assistant, assisting with events, our historic properties exchange, social media, and outreach. We also have 3 circuit riders who are our boots on the ground and come out to your communities to assist with any preservation issues, Mike Farino, Brad Scheid, and Stacy Vero. So feel free to contact any of us, all of us, contact@preservationct.org or check our website for our staff directory. We are here to help. So we're doing these talks in the time of COVID to help support our mission and be out in the communities as much as possible and talking with folks, sharing our experiences and our partners' work and having a chance to talk with you all. So feel free to ask questions in the chat or speak freely at the end or follow up afterwards with any questions you may have of Preservation Connecticut or the SHPO office. So with that, I'll turn it over to our guest today, Jonathan Kinney.
Great, thank you, Jane, and thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you all today. I started with the SHPO office back in July of last year. Before that, I was with the New Jersey State Historic Preservation Office for 13 years. I am still getting my feet wet as far as the Connecticut specific stuff goes, but I am going to do my best here. And if there are any questions I can't answer today, I will certainly get you the correct information. So I've got quite a bit in here, and what I tried to do throughout the presentation is put links to whatever I was talking about on the screen, and we can certainly share a PDF of the slides with you later, and you can go ahead and look up that additional information if you need it, and you can always reach out to me or staff with any questions you may have. But my goal today was just to sort of talk about a few SHPO basics, the who, what, when, where, why, and how, what our federal responsibilities are as an office, and then talk a little bit about our Connecticut specific programs, and then just wrap up with some things we're excited about and things we're looking forward to getting done in this coming year. Next slide, Jane. So here is just a quick snapshot of our staff and their responsibilities. Again, we'll send this out in case you need contact information for anyone, but we have 8 full-time staff as well as myself. Next slide, Jane. Okay, so where did the SHPOs come from? So we kind of go back all the way to 1966 when the National Historic Preservation Act was passed. This was at a time when Americans were obviously becoming increasingly aware of the damage that was being done to our heritage. by large federal programs such as the Interstate Highway System and urban renewal initiatives. So what the National Historic Preservation Act does is it sets up sort of the legal and administrative context for the National Historic Preservation Program, and also created a number of organizations and processes that we still use today that are required to carry out that program. So the Act creates the state historic preservation offices, one in each state and in the territories as well. So we are responsible for administering that federal program at the state level. The Act also charged each federal agency with certain responsibilities as with regard to identifying and protecting historic properties. And included in that is to take into consideration their impacts on historic properties when they're planning a project, and that's done through a process known as Section 106, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The Act also created the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is an independent federal agency responsible for advising the President and Congress on historic preservation matters, and also overseeing the Section 106 process. And finally, the Act also created the National Register of Historic Places, which I'll talk on in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Next slide. So here are some of the later amendments post-1966 to the Act and what they accomplished. You can take a quick look at those. Things like extending 106 down to National Register eligible properties, creating the Certified Local Government Program in 1980, which I will also discuss in a little bit of detail here, and granting greater participation to Native Americans and Native Hawaiians. So the Act is sort of a living thing that evolves as the need arises with these amendments. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what do we do? The State Historic Preservation Office, we are responsible for overseeing the government program of historic preservation for Connecticut citizens. We administer a range of programs, basically to identify, register, and protect those properties that are important to Connecticut's cultural heritage. We will, the office will be turning 66 this year. It was originally established before the National Historic Preservation Act back in 1955. And we are now located within the Department of Economic and Community Development. And there you see a photo of our office complex in Hartford. Okay, next slide. So I will not read all of this text, but here you can just sort of get a good snapshot of what our responsibilities are. We wear different hats depending on why you're talking to us or what program we're working on. We wear a federal hat sometimes and a state hat sometimes, and sometimes we will wear both at the same time. But we are charged by the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior with fulfilling the bullet points you see there on the left, which includes surveying for historic properties within the state, keeping an inventory of those properties, nominating properties to the National Register of Historic Places, helping federal and state agencies with their regulatory responsibilities, training, outreach, education, certifying local governments into the CLG program, and also working with Section 106, as I mentioned. And on the state side, we have some correspond to our federal responsibilities, some are completely unique to Connecticut. So there you'll see that we maintain and manage historic house museums and historic sites. There are 4 in Connecticut that we run. We coordinate state heritage tourism efforts. We hold preservation easements, manage the state rehabilitation tax credit, which piggybacks onto the federal tax credit, which I'll touch on, and also do project review pursuant to some state laws that take into consideration effects on historic properties. Okay, next slide, Jay. So I don't know if you noticed, but on the left side of that, the federal mandates there, one of our charges is to prepare and implement a statewide historic preservation plan. So the current plan we are operating under goes from 2018 to 2023. The title of it is Shared Stewardship, and that basically lays out 4 main goals, which we're hoping to accomplish while doing all of this work that we're responsible for. So goal number 1 is to enrich and expand our partnerships with organizations such as Preservation Connecticut and others across the state. We want to always be enhancing and furthering our education efforts. and outreach efforts. We're trying to diversify our audiences and our resources, so not just the communities and the folks that we're talking to, but also the kinds of resources that we're looking at and evaluating. And also we want to be developing a resiliency strategy for historic properties so that they are as protected as they can be from future storm events and things like that. So as I mentioned, the title of our plan is Shared Stewardship. Could you go to the next slide, Jane? Here is sort of just a visualization of all of those partnerships that we have with federal, state, and local organizations. We work with other government agencies, obviously, communities, nonprofits and universities, and cultural resource firms and professionals in the field. And while we all have different roles and responsibilities, you can see that we're all working towards that same goal of stewardship of our cultural resources. Okay, next slide. So let's talk briefly about historic designations, because they're sort of at the heart of what we do in the SHPO, and that is National Historic Landmarks, National Register of Historic Places, State Register, local districts, and things like that. Okay, next slide. So Connecticut has over 60 National Historic Landmarks, which is the highest level of designation a property can achieve. We have more than 51,000 properties listed on the National Register. That's both individually and within historic districts. 75,000 properties listed on our Connecticut State Register, and over 125 districts and 8,000 buildings designated at the local level by our municipalities. Okay, next slide. So just a quick distinction between what all those designations are for those who may not be as familiar. As I said, National Historic Landmarks, or NHLs, are the highest level of designation a property can achieve. Those are properties that are nationally significant. They are designated as such by the National Park Service, the NHL staff specifically. It does require owner consent, and it does afford some additional protection to those properties. And I've given you a link there to the NHL program if you're interested in learning more about that. The next layer down is much more common. Obviously, it's the National Register of Historic Places, and the key piece here is that these are properties that are not only nationally significant, these can be properties that are also significant at the state or even local level. These are reviewed by a body known as the Preservation Review Board, and then they are sent to the National Park Service once an application is submitted for designation, sent to the National Park Service for the final sign-off. And as in a district situation, this does require consent from majority of the private property owners to add that to the register. And this, again, does add some additional protection to the property and also opens up the property to the potential for some financial incentives. Okay, next slide. Moving down to State Register, this was implemented in 1975, and this is Connecticut's official list of historic properties. Again, these are properties of local or state significance. These are reviewed by the Historic Preservation Council. Does not require owner consent, as you can see. And I will go into a little bit more detail in a little while about what properties are on the State Register. And also a link there to some additional information. And then we have our local properties. So these are the properties that our municipalities have determined that that are significant and they would like to recognize and or protect. Again, this is created by the Town Historic Commission and also can add a layer of protection through a local review ordinance. And again, a link to some additional information if you're interested in that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the National Register, as I said, is the official list of the country's historic places. It is honorary. It is designed to recognize the value of properties that have contributed to our history, and it also promotes appreciation and celebrates our heritage. And it is a National Park Service program, as I mentioned, but we administer it here at the state level through in the SHPO's office. Okay, next slide. So are all old things historic? The answer is no, obviously. In fact, there are very specific, well-defined criteria that a property or resource must meet in order to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and I'll go into that for a few minutes here. Okay, next slide. So in order to be added onto the National Register, your property has to be either a site, a building, a structure, or an object, or part of a larger district. It also has to be significant in one of those categories: American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, or culture. Okay, next slide. In addition to that, if you've got a building or a site or a district and it's significant in one of those areas, it also has to meet one of these 4 criteria. It can meet more than one, but it has to meet a minimum of one. So you'll hear buildings referenced, as being significant under criterion A, and that is association with a specific event or a pattern of events. Criterion B is association with a significant individual, typically where their productive work happened or occurred. Criterion C is what you would typically see for architecture. So the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. This is also used for districts that are a unique identifiable entity to themselves. And criterion D is the one that we typically see for archaeology. It can be used for structure sometimes, but typically archaeology, and that's the ability for a property to yield information that's important in history. Okay. And then sort of the final piece of the puzzle, once you've got all that put together, you have to make sure that the property has integrity. On the left, you'll see the 7 factors of integrity. We want to make sure that a building has as many of those as we can. They don't always have strong integrity in all of those categories, but it's important to remember that integrity is not the same as condition. So clearly the owners of the property on the right have kept up their property and made modifications. However, when you contrast it to a similar property on the left in the same neighborhood, it becomes clear that many features that once characterized that property have been lost. So we would conclude that the property on the right has diminished integrity for sure. Okay, next. Okay, so why would why list a property? Here you see some of the reasons. So we get recognition and protection, appreciation planning, incentives, some flexibility in building codes, but like I said, mostly honorary, but it does afford protection. So you have consideration during environmental review processes, eligibility for easements or archaeological preserves, which, like I said, place a layer of protection typically from public undertakings, so federal or state undertakings. Okay, next slide, please. Some questions people typically ask about NR and SR listing. There are no, like I said, no restrictions placed on a private property owner. They're not obligated to make their property public or restore it or maintain it. They can sell, develop, or use their property in any way they see fit. And that, like I said, that is strictly from the National Register. There are no restrictions placed on a private property owner unless there's some use of federal funds or federal permitting. Okay, next slide. A little bit about our state register. It is, like I said, the official list of the state's historic resources, and it includes a number of lists of properties. So it took all of the properties that were in the 1966-67 survey of historic properties done by the Historical Commission and added them. All the properties that we have listed on the National Register are automatically listed into the state register. All properties that are approved at the local level. And a couple other bullets there as far as, and then anything that people come in to put specifically on the state register that go before the Historic Preservation Council. Okay, next slide. And I'll just touch on really briefly protections at the local level, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The enabling legislation allows a municipality to create a historic district commission to designate local historic districts. And the goal there is to promote the educational, cultural, economic, and general welfare of the public through preservation and protection of the distinctive characteristics of buildings and places associated with the history of our indicative of a period or style of architecture of the municipality, of the state, or of the nation. And there is the citation for where you can find that language. Next slide, please. And the regulatory piece to the local side is done through the process of obtaining a certificate of appropriateness. And just one section from that rule, from the language basically states that no building or structure shall be erected or altered within a historic district until after an application for a certificate of appropriateness as to exterior architectural features has been submitted to the district commission and approved. So you have to, if this is where regulatory review over a private undertaking would come in as opposed to a public undertaking through the national or state register. Okay, next slide, please. On the federal side, we also manage a program called the Certified Local Government Program. This is basically a formalized partnership between the National Park Service, the state, and the municipalities. It was enacted in 1980 after the relationship between the feds and the states were working so well, they decided to sort of pull in the municipalities. So this formalized partnerships, the goal is to basically promote local participation in the larger state and federal programs. It's also to promote your local historic preservation efforts, and it also provides technical assistance and grant funding to the municipalities. These CLGs become eligible for grant funding to support both of those goals. Okay, next slide. One of the other major programs that our office is responsible for, and it's on the federal and state side, is environmental review, and that's working with agencies that are planning projects to ensure that they are minimizing or avoiding impacts to historic properties. The two primary laws that we're looking at projects through are Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and at the state level, the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act. And state and federal governments, as it says here, must consider the effects of their actions to significant historic resources before committing to funding or permitting. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on the environmental review process here. Okay, next slide, please. Here's just a summary chart of some federal laws that we do get involved with, primarily, as I said, Section 106, but we do have an involvement in NEPA, which is the federal environmental law. Sometimes those two processes are coordinated to work together. And then Section 4F is a DOT specific law, which we are sort of involved with from time to time when we're reviewing a DOT project. Okay. So it's important to remember that the SHPO is, our main role is to represent the interests of Connecticut and its citizens in historic preservation when we're reviewing projects pursuant to these laws. So when we're looking at something on the federal side, properties that are those that are listed in the National Register and are eligible, those are the properties that we're concerned with through the Section 106 process. And under state law, we are looking at properties that are eligible for or listed in the State Register of Historic Places. Okay. The state level, as I said, the Environmental Policy Act, it's sort of a state level NEPA, which is, like, as I said, the federal environmental law. It applies to all state funded or permitted projects. So if a state agency is proposing a project, they have to consider whether or not that action is going to disrupt or alter a historic, architectural, or archaeological resource. And then we work with the Office of Policy Management to make sure that these state agencies are effectively taking into consideration cultural resources when they're moving forward with their plans. Okay, next slide, please. So for all of those processes, basically the same 4 steps are involved. This is, from a very high level, but first thing we want to do is take a project and look at it to make sure that it actually does have the potential to impact a historic resource. And if it does, we move on to the next step, which is trying to figure out whether or not there are any historic properties in the area that we need to be concerned about. And those are both above ground and below ground. We're talking about, architectural resources or landscapes or archaeological resources as well. And then the next thing we want to do is, once we've established that there are potentially historic resources in the area, we want to assess whether or not that project is going to be affected, and if that effect is going to be adverse, if that resource is going to be harmed in some way. If it is, we go on to figuring out how to resolve that effect, and we want to try to avoid it if we can. If there's no way to avoid it completely, we want to try to minimize those impacts, and if we can't fully minimize them, then there has to be some sort of mitigation to make up for that loss. Okay, just sort of a snapshot of the different types of projects we review, because there is some either federal or state hook. So a dam project could have licensing from a federal agency such as FERC, or it could have environmental permits. Excuse me, talking too fast. Bank licensing from the FDIC. FCC is permitting is permitting cell towers. I'm not sure what that photo in the center is. It looks like a house being renovated. It could be HUD. If there's HUD funding involved, that could be a federal hook for us for 106. It looks like there's a either a cleanup, maybe a brownfield cleanup or an EPA cleanup that would trigger state and federal review. And also if federal highway or DOT is working on a highway, that would trigger our review as well. Okay. And, you know, these are examples from Connecticut that we, in the past, have been successful in saving resources through the environmental review process. This was a building that was located on the site of a proposed redevelopment. And as part of the mitigation, because the impacts couldn't be completely avoided, the building, we required that the building be retained. I think there's another example here too. This is, yep, a bridge, New Haven, Hartford, Springfield Rail Bridge. Retention of this structure was part of the mitigation. So we negotiate the mitigation with the agency as we go forward and determine what a good mitigation or package of mitigation is, you know, equivalent with a loss to the historic resource that's being harmed. Okay. And then another state law that we have, which Preservation Connecticut works with us on, is the Environmental Protection Act, which allows for legal recourse if there's an unreasonable destruction of a Connecticut historic resources. And this includes historic properties listed on the National Register. What we consider an unreasonable destruction is a demolition of a property when there are reasonable and prudent alternatives to that demolition. So if there is some other way to utilize that building, somebody can move forward and file suit against the property owner that is proposing that demolition. And the Office of the Attorney General will investigate that for us. Okay. I briefly mentioned archaeology before, but it's important to note that through all of these programs, archaeology is sort of constantly there, and we're constantly considering it, both in survey efforts, in our environmental review, when we're providing technical assistance to local agencies or residents, and also when we're giving out grants. Archaeology is an important piece to the puzzle in many of our programs. Okay, and we also have the Archaeological Preserve Program, which allows for strict criminal penalties, I believe, for harming archaeological resources in Connecticut without a permit. So this does require that permits are obtained for doing any archaeological work on state lands. And I know, and Kathy is on the line in case anybody has any questions, our staff archaeologist. I am not an archaeologist. Next slide. So how do we review projects? So the key here is, some of you may be familiar with the Secretary of the Interior standards. What we're using here is this set of 10 guidelines when we're looking at a project to determine whether or not it meets these standards. And these are just sort of, you know, intentionally broad recommendations for how a project can be done in a sensitive manner to a historic resource, such as historic character shall be retained and preserved, distinctive features shall be preserved, repair when it's possible, and then only if it's not possible, replace in kind, such, you know, things such as that. Okay. And I'll just get into a little bit of a discussion about our economic incentives that we have. And these include grants and tax credits, which I'll also talk about. So we give away over, I believe, well over $1 million a year in grant funding. And since the Community Investment Act was passed in 2005, the SHPO has awarded almost $27 million in CIA funds to different recipients. So that's just fantastic. And there's a link to some of our programs on that page if you're interested. Just a little bit more detail about some of the programs that we have here, such as survey and planning. This is funded by the CIA. The eligible activities that you see here, these are pre-construction, obviously, and these would naturally lead into a capital grant if you wanted to move forward and pursue that as well. But you could do an inventory, historic resources inventory, state and national register designations. As I said, pre-development studies, conditions assessments, feasibility studies. You could have architectural plans drawn up, and also outreach tools could be put together with this funding as well. And the next grant program is the Historic Restoration Fund grants, which is our large capital grants. These are matching reimbursable grants of up to $100,000 to municipalities and nonprofits for capital work, archaeological site protection, and these are for properties that are listed on either the state or national register. And you see some key details there. They range from $5,000 to $100,000. They must be matched, reimbursable. All work has to adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards, which I just went over, and must be open to the public, or work must be visible to the public. Okay. Okay, now I will just chat briefly about the state and federal historic rehabilitation tax credits. Next slide, Jane. So the current federal tax incentives that we have for historic rehabilitation projects were established by the Tax Reform Act of 1986. The applications are filed with our office. This is for the federal program, filed with our office. We conduct a preliminary review, and then we send it to the National Park Service, who makes the final determination. So these are meant to encourage private investment in historic properties. This is the federal tax credit provides 20% of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures as a credit against your federal income taxes. These are for income producing properties, so that could be rental residential, mixed use, office or commercial or manufacturing. No site work is allowed in there, and all the work must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. We also are very lucky and fortunate to have a state historic rehabilitation tax credit, which can piggyback on the federal program, and that provides a 25% tax credit. 30% if you are including an affordable housing component. And that is for anything with a residential use of 5 units or more, mixed residential or non-residential. And that is also reviewed as an application submitted to our office and is reviewed by Julie Carmelik in our office. Okay, here's, I think, just some examples of different tax credit projects that have happened in Connecticut over the years. This is Yale Allentown Industrial Complex, which earned over $5.9 million in state historic rehabilitation tax credits and rehabilitated 5 buildings. Winchester Repeating Arms Complex in New Haven, $16 million in historic rehabilitation tax credits and rehabilitated 8 buildings. And Mechanic and Farmer Savings Bank in Bridgeport, which earned over $2.4 million in state rehab tax credits. So you can see the amazing results from these programs. So a lot of these programs, a lot of this funding is for nonprofits or municipalities. So it's important that we also have this program, which is the Historic Homes Rehabilitation Tax Credit. And this is for this is basically designed to encourage new home ownership and to assist existing homeowners in maintaining or rehabbing their property. It's a 30% tax credit up to $30,000 per dwelling unit for the rehab of 1 to 4 family buildings. And after the completion of the rehab work, 1 unit must be owner occupied for a period of 5 years. Okay, so that brings us to right now. So we have a couple exciting things going on at the moment. I just kind of captured 4 of them in this slide, which is things that we have upcoming in 2021. The first is our office is currently working with a consultant to develop a statewide cultural resource GIS system, which will allow folks to basically access the web and go online and find out where all the historic resources in the state are located, find out some information about them. And that is in the works. It will probably be in the works for most of 2021. We're hoping to have that completed by 2022. But we will make a lot of progress on that this year, and I'm very excited about that. The second initiative that we are currently working on is Olmsted 200 to celebrate the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted, which I believe is in April 2022, but we are getting things rolling now, and there are going to be events, I think, kind of throughout the year. So we're proposing to do a large survey of Olmsted properties, as well as a context study of their work in Connecticut as well. The Connecticut Freedom Trail, which I hope a lot of you are familiar with, is a network of sites that embody the struggle toward freedom and human dignity and celebrate the accomplishment of the state's African American community. The just recently, we awarded a large grant to the Connecticut Democracy Center to contract with a person to become the first outreach coordinator, the first staff basically for the Freedom Trail. So this is a great next step for the Freedom Trail. They're also considering hiring an intern, and basically these people will be able to dedicate their full-time, work to the Freedom Trail, developing it, putting together narratives, brochures, enhancing the website, putting on events, and promoting preservation of the sites that are in the trail. And it's going to be a wonderful development for that program. And then the last thing that we're focusing on this year is trying to take a hard look at our processes and our programs, and making sure that to the extent possible, we are incorporating racial equity into our work, in what we in the grants we award, in the resources that we look at, in the documents we put out. So that's something we are very excited about. And next slide. That's all I have. Does anybody have any questions? I threw a lot at you there.
That was great. Thank you, Jonathan.
You're welcome.
You do cover a lot of territory at the SHPO office.
We have no shortage of things to do.
I don't have anything in the chat just yet. If anyone wanted to go ahead and ask a question, you're welcome to.
I'll be here till 1 o'clock if you think of anything.
One of the questions that came in before the meeting was about the National Register and thoughts about strengthening the National Register. And I know you had touched on how it's an honorific listing for the most part. But there is, that one piece of it in Connecticut that gives it some teeth. The
Protection Act, yeah, that's unique. We didn't have anything like that in New Jersey, so that's actually a very strong tool that Connecticut has that allows the people to go through that process to stop a proposed demolition of a National Register site. We had a state register law in New Jersey that was very strong, but nothing similar to the Protection Act in Connecticut. But it's a great resource. It's not used very often, but the key is that there has to be a lot of community input, and there needs to be a movement to get behind the attempt to prevent the demolition of the resource that's going through the process.
Exactly. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I know the SHPO office in the past has hosted statewide conferences.
Mm-hmm.
I know with the era of COVID, that's not really a thing, but are you continuing that going forward?
I would love to, absolutely. Yeah, I think the first one was kind of right before I started, or maybe first couple, but we haven't really discussed doing one this year just because of COVID, but and we're all stretched pretty thin, but we would absolutely love to get back to that as for sure. I know a few states and some other organizations have done virtual ones, so depending on what the time frame of us getting back into the office is, we'll certainly be looking at that. But I would love to do an in-person one because I want to meet you all in person.
We'll be so ready to get out there.
I still have members of my staff that I haven't met in person. It's a very strange world.
It is. Hi, Bill, you have a question?
A question and a comment. The comment is easy. There was one slide, and I forgot the title because you're moving along pretty quickly. Luckily, it had a great map of the Westbrook Historic District, but the list of towns did not include Westbrook. It's minor.
Oh, is that the CLG slide? That might have been the CLG slide.
But it caught my attention because it was my town, the map. We weren't in the list. So not a big deal, but probably nobody else would know.
I'm impressed.
So, Mike,
if Westbrook's interested in becoming a CLG, I'd be happy to discuss it with him, Jonathan.
Yes, That's Mary Dunn, our CLG
Sorry.
coordinator.
I mean, what CLG was?
CLG is the Certified Local Government Program. So that is municipalities that have gone through a certification process and met certain requirements in order to be invited to join by the National Park Service. They're certified, and then that opens them up to eligibility for grant funding and sort of enhanced technical assistance as part of that program.
Okay.
They're sort of considered the gold standard of local preservation programs.
It's kind of like sustainability only for historic resources.
Yeah, they've sort of met certain milestones, you know, that the states and the Park Service set that they have to get to become certified.
And my question was going to be, we were working on a section of the town website pointing out that we have a historic district, and I put just a general link to SHPO, but is there any, like, your presentation was really good about what it is, maybe a few of the slides, but just, is there any specific page on the site that's like for, say, a commercial property owner in a district or for private? Because one of the things I've been promoting is, okay, now we have a historic district. People complain when we lose a building, but one source of money to help people preserve them is this.
Right. Well, yes. So the CLG grants are typically given to the municipality itself to do some sort of planning project to enhance preservation in the community. But for the private business owner, you know, those tax credit projects, programs are excellent. But there is some information on our website about that program. I think I included it in the link. If not, we can certainly get you some more information. And I know the National Park Service has a big CLG website.
I put a link to them too, so.
Great.
Okay.
Could I ask something? I'm interested in the tax credit when you're going to develop a place for housing. Can you explain that a little bit more? And is it relegated to a particular area or a type of building? What are the parameters around that?
So you're talking about the commercial tax credits? So if, say, take an old mill building and convert it into housing, something like
either that, or if a historic society decided that in order to preserve a building, they would get somebody to go in and do it.
Yep. So the key is, for the federal tax credit program, the key is that the building has to be income producing, and it has to be a certified historic structure, which means it has to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So then the costs of the work that is done as part of that project, 20% of that can be received as a credit towards your federal income tax.
Okay, assuming it is a nonprofit building, a non-tax producing, but will begin producing tax income once it's renovated?
Yeah, I believe as long as the end use is going to be income producing, I believe that's correct. Julie, I know you're on the line.
Well, it's always a little tricky with nonprofit organizations because because if you're going to be using the federal tax credit, you have to have a federal tax liability, and nonprofits don't. So you'd have to set up some kind of for-profit subsidiary to be able to take advantage of the federal credit. Having said that, the state credit doesn't have those same restrictions because the state tax credit is sold to a corporation that will then use it.
There you go.
So a nonprofit is eligible to apply for the state credit.
That's Julie Carmelik. She's our tax credit reviewer.
Okay, thank you.
There she is. Thanks, Julie.
There's a question in the chat. Jonathan, do you have any recommendations for people who are thinking of a career in historic preservation?
Oh my goodness. I sort of came into the field sideways, so I didn't go to school specifically for historic preservation. I got a degree in history and started working with a local historical society and just sort of ended up at the SHPO, which just worked out great and was wonderful. But yeah, I mean, there are so many great preservation programs out there. I would recommend, you know, volunteering maybe with a nonprofit to get some experience. I would recommend interning. A lot of the full-time staff in the New Jersey office where I worked were once interns. So if you're really interested, you know, in government specific historic preservation, definitely some internships with the SHPO are great. You know, there are cultural resource firms where you can go out and do the actual field work and survey, preparing reports. There are so many aspects to preservation. You know, you need to sort of focus in. There are, you know, the actual physical trades, you know, conservation, work of historic materials. So I don't see that question in the chat, but I'd be happy to talk with that person more if they'd be interested.
And there's enthusiasm in the chat for the CCSU Public History Program. I know at Preservation Connecticut, we've had several interns from that program who have.
We just had an intern start in January, and she's a current CCSU student as well. She's in her final year of the graduate program there.
And getting back to the National Register designations, what are the costs associated with pursuing a National Register listing?
Oh, that's an excellent question that I would need to talk to a consultant about. Depends on the, well, it always depends.
Yes.
Depends on if you're talking about an individual building. It depends on how complex that building is. It depends on if you're talking about a large historic district with multiple buildings, and if each one of those buildings is complex. I know, you know, we did a survey of big mill complexes in Paterson, New Jersey, which, you know, obviously was much more involved than, say, a residential neighborhood where you've got a lot of cookie cutter houses that all have the same history, very similar architectural descriptions, very similar context. So it's going to depend on the property. But are there any consultants on? I'm trying to, I don't, it's a long time since I.
Yeah, it's definitely a range for sure, depending on what you need to include.
Yeah.
And I would definitely say reaching out to the SHPO office.
Yeah.
Soon in the process.
Jenny was on, I'm sure she could answer that question.
About integrity and eligibility and get all of that sorted out too.
Yeah, if you want to reach out to the office, we can certainly get you an answer, or at least a ballpark, depending on what property you're talking about.
Can we just say, though, that there are no costs associated with the program itself, right? So it's just consultant costs, just to clarify
correct.
that part.
Yeah. No, you know,
so that part's clear.
That's a very good clarification. Thank you, Stacy. Yeah, no, it doesn't cost you anything to have your building on the National Register. It would cost you to, unless you wanted to do the nomination work yourself. If you wanted to hire a professional consultant to do it, that would be the cost in preparing that documentation and forwarding it to the office.
Looking to see if anyone's raising their hand. What are your thoughts, Jonathan, related to balancing preservation with the desire to implement green energy upgrades?
Oh my.
That could be a whole.
That's a whole presentation in and of itself. I mean, it's so important. You know, it's so important. Preservation in and of itself is a green practice. I mean, you know, the greenest building, I should say, is the one that's already standing. So rehabilitation and reuse of a historic structure will avoid, you know, the loss of all the embodied energy that's in that building already from production of the materials, and avoid putting all that material in a landfill and having to, you know, rebuild a structure. But there is certainly a, you know, a whole world of discussions about how best to incorporate green technology into historic buildings. Different municipalities do it in different ways, but I think you have to be creative. You know, I think the technology is advancing very rapidly. So I think we have to stay on top of that. You know, things such as solar panels and solar shingles now that we're going to be putting on buildings that look like real, you know, traditional building shingles. Cape May, New Jersey, put some language in their local ordinance about where on a building, where it was visible, so you can't have anything visible from the street as far as solar panels or other green technology. But it's something that I think a municipality or locale has to sort of take a big picture look at and figure out what their goals are as far as preservation goes. And this is from a local commission standpoint, but yeah, that's a big question.
And we do try to tackle that somewhat when we do our trainings with local historic district commissions.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot, incorporating.
But it's moving very quickly, and it's something that the preservation field needs to stay on top of for sure, because it's frequently used as a justification against preservation, and I think we can make sure that we use it as a justification for preservation. My windows are drafty, I'm losing heat, I'm wasting energy. I think there's a lot of education involved, and we have to make sure that people are aware that historic buildings can be adapted to incorporate that technology.
Jonathan, can you describe the distinction between properties listed on the NR and the state register? I mean, what's the distinction?
A lot of buildings are listed on both. So there is no distinction for a lot of the buildings, but my understanding is that, there's a little bit more flexibility on the state register side. So if there's a building that's really important, that people feel strongly about, but it may not make the cut at the National Park Service level for designation on the National Register, it may still be eligible for the state register. And that's obviously on a case-by-case basis, but there's a lot of overlap between the two registers. So all of the buildings on the National Register are also on the state register. But the criteria are very similar, but slightly different between the two.
Same but different.
Same but different.
How is the SHPO working with traditionally marginalized communities to ensure stewardship of their cultural resources?
That is something we are absolutely working on, and that's part of that ongoing equity effort that we have, getting into those communities and, most importantly, finding out what they feel is important, what the resources are that those communities believe are worth preserving, and working with them to try to make that happen. And that's a major goal in our statewide preservation plan, and that requires a lot of partnerships and developing new relationships. But that's sort of the evolution of preservation in and of itself is going from the houses of the founding fathers, where it all started, to going into these communities and these neighborhoods to really find out what the culturally significant resources are that people in neighborhoods, everyday people in neighborhoods care about and want to see preserved. So that's an ongoing effort for us, and I hope we can make a lot of progress on that in this year.
Agree. It's an ongoing effort for all of us.
Yep.
Let's see, a lot of questions in the chat now.
Oh boy.
How do we best evaluate and communicate the economic impacts of historic preservation? We've done some studies. Probably need to revisit those. It's been a little while.
It's a great question and very timely, because we were just talking this week or last week about potentially bringing another intern on to work on that very question. So there have certainly been studies about the impacts of designation of properties, particularly local historic districts, and where real estate prices go when that happens. But historic preservation is not only a quality of life issue, it's also a major economic driver, and has been shown time and time again to be a major economic driver. For downtowns, for, as I said, real estate prices, but we are certainly due for an update to an economic impact study. And I think we're going to be hopefully moving forward with that very shortly, because it's not, you know, it's good to have that information. It's good to be able to sell preservation from that standpoint, and it's also good for you know, legislators and the people that make the decisions, and provide the funding through the CIA, which is so important to know, you know, that this is actually boosting the economy in a really positive way.
Yeah, we do refer to those studies all the time
Yeah,
when we get
absolutely.
these questions. Will the Freedom Trail be investigating Underground Railroad claims?
Good question. I don't know. I'm sure it has in the past. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but if whoever asked the question would like to follow up or have a conversation, I can loop in our Freedom Trail coordinator, Todd Levine, and I'm sure he could let us know, you know, if there are any sites that are documented on the Underground Railroad on the trail already, and whether or not there are any that we've been made aware of that warrant further investigation.
Yeah, interesting. Did anyone else want
Good
to?
questions.
Oh, Ginny, are you trying to talk?
Sorry.
There you go.
If the, on the Freedom Trail thing, if an Underground Railroad site is there, what is the obligation of the homeowner in terms of the Freedom Trail?
No obligation. They're not required to join it, but if they were interested in doing so, they would be, you know, they'd be welcome.
Okay, so
to reach
it's on that basis rather than, but if they would not mind being listed, but don't want people coming through their home or whatever.
Yeah, no, there'd be no obligation to have people in their home at all.
Okay.
Who is a good contact at SHPO for questions regarding registering a historic site that doesn't have any buildings on it?
It would, is it an archaeological site? Is it a landscape? I don't.
Yeah.
Well, I could give you two names. It would be Marina Wisniewski for the state register and Jenny Schofield for the national register.
And yes, we'll be sharing the presentation. I think we have everyone's emails here. We'll share the slide deck as a PDF, and the whole program is being recorded, and that'll be on Preservation Connecticut's YouTube channel. So you can share and revisit that way.
Great.
And you can certainly continue the conversation with us, you know, through email, phone
Yeah,
calls.
if anybody has any follow-up questions, or I didn't give you a sufficient answer to your question, please don't hesitate to reach out and I'll get you some information for sure.
Are all here to help. And if no one has any more questions, I'll just share my screen again and just give you the last two slides here. So I want to thank you all for being with us. Jonathan, thank you for your time.
Thank you all.
And
Thank you, Jane.
everyone that joined in, thank you. And please remember, Preservation Connecticut is a membership organization. So if you're not a member, please join us. And not only do we appreciate your membership dollars, but we appreciate you as a member, a physical member, as part of our constituency. So we need all the folks in Connecticut to support us at the legislature and to help, you know, in your communities with preservation issues. So being a member is more than a monetary commitment to us. So thank you for being members. And these are some of the resources that we can share with you when I send out the PowerPoint for this presentation. There are resources here to link on. Oops. And next week we have Maisa Tisdale from the Freedom Center, the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center in Bridgeport. So we're really excited to get updated on what they have going on there in Bridgeport. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Hope to see you next week. Thanks,
Thank you,
Jonathan.
everyone. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Good job, Jonathan.
Thank you.